Well, thank you, Chair. The issues regarding the Canada Summer Student Service Grant and the Trudeau government, we are now into the fourth, coming almost into the fifth month of this issue. I have never, in my 16 years sitting on multiple committees, ever been in a situation where a committee was unable to finish a report that it began. Unable to finish because of continual interference by government members, continual points of order, continual efforts to stop the committee in its work. This is really unprecedented territory. I find this really disturbing now because as the Liberals have been doing everything they procedurally can to stop us from finalizing our report, we learned that the Kielburger Group has engaged in a massive, seems very well-paid publicity campaign to counter the work of our committee. They brought in American Foundation money, American spokesmen. And these apparently have hired a number of people doing op-eds and supposed reports to debunk the work of a committee that has been unable to finish its work. I find that very, very troubling for the state of parliamentary democracy, that we are having our hands tied by the Liberals while the Kielburger Group are able to rely on big American donors to take out full-page ads in newspapers, making claims that simply don't add up to what we've already managed to find in the documents. I think this is really concerning because when the issue first came up of the Canada Summer Student Service Grant, we had no interest in going after We Charity. We were not all that interested in their work. We were interested in their connections to the Trudeau government, the deep connections that they had built up, certainly with the Prime Minister's family, the hiring of the Prime Minister's mother and brother, his wife being deeply involved. Was there a connection? That's a legitimate question. We then found out about the deep connections with Bill Morneau, with his family, with the free trips. We then learned that a number of the key ministers who were involved in the decision had been invited to participate in the We Days. So that was our focus, was how did this group that is a supposed charity for children get such an inside track on a deal that is between $500 and $912 million. It was the Kielburger brothers who insisted on coming before committee. It was the Kielburger brothers who insisted on swearing under oath, which is a very extraordinary thing to do. And it was in that testimony that a number of questions began to get raised in my mind about how they run their operations. So I want to speak to this publicity campaign, this disinformation campaign that seems to be very well funded, that is attempting, I believe, to obstruct the work of our committee and to undermine the credibility of the evidence that we've attempted to gather, while the Liberals are doing everything they can to make sure that we cannot present our report. Now, before I get into the various people and who've been hired by those Kielburgers and how it's laid out, what I find very, very surprising to me is a pattern. Again, for a group that is a children's charity, a group that tells really great stories to kids in every school in the country, it seems, they have access to. And yet we find when it comes to their very aggressive approach to their public image, for example, they hired the Republicans' Oppo firm, Firehouse Strategies. So we paid over $600,000 to U.S. political consulting firms, including Firehouse Strategies. Now, that comes from internal revenue sources for the fiscal year ending August 2019, showing the U.S. arm of the Toronto-based charity paid three firms a total of $605,853, including the $130,000 that was paid to Firehouse Strategies. Now, so I don't assume that anybody in our committee is aware of Firehouse Strategies, so I think it's worth illuminating who they are. This was a company started by veterans of Marco Rubio's presidential campaign. And what they claim to do is teach people to do combative media training. I'm wondering now why a child's charity needs to do combative media training done by Republican groups that come out of the Marco Rubio team. But the combative and defensive media training, they say, came out of having learned from the Trump campaign that firm's founders adopted Trump's aggressive methods after he so easily beat Marco Rubio. The quote is, after managing U.S. Senator Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign, and as they say, losing to a reality TV star in the late stages of the primary process, 3 longtime GOP operatives, Terry Sullivan, Alex Connett, and Will Hawley, gave up their campaign trail to start the Washington Public Affairs shop, Firehouse Strategies. Their strategy, here's the kicker, take lessons learned from that wild election cycle, the one in which Donald Trump upended modern communications, and use them to help clients communicate in the modern age. Again, I'm thinking, well, this is a child's charity that tells us they're worried about children in Kenya. Why would they be wanting to use the Donald Trump election strategy that has upended modern communications? So, how was it used? Well, according to the Globe and Mail, last year, before the Firehouse contract came to light, Canada Land, the journal that has raised serious questions about the Kielburger organization, began asking why a number of U.S. Republican consultants had written articles attacking the news outlet and whether it was part of an organized campaign. So one of those Republican operatives who attacked Canada Land is Ben Proler, who worked on the Rubio campaign, and is currently on the board of the U.S. Political Action Committee Maverick PAC, which, quote, provides a platform to engage the next generation of young conservative professionals in business and politics. And this is really interesting. So the media strategy to attack journalists who were raising questions about was that they were, quote, this Canada Land was, quote, adding to Canada's growing fake news fears. Wow. Again, a charity looking after children is hiring a Republican firm to embed newspaper articles in the United States, accusing Canadian journalists of fake news. Now, another place that they managed to get content was through Zachary Almond, a former chair of the North Carolina Federation of College Republicans and a former political consultant to Representative Robert Pittenger. Now, so he was one of Rubio's key people in the North Carolina campaign. And in November 2018, Mr. Almond wrote an article for Red State, a U.S. conservative bloc, criticizing, again, a Canadian journal for, quote, false content. The IRS filing shows that we paid another American consultancy firm, 202 Strategies, $297,570 in the last fiscal year, but we have no record of what this organization did. So, when I'm reading these articles by the media team that's been put together for the Kielburgers, claiming that 100% of all the monies goes to the charity, and I'm thinking, well, then who's paying these operatives? We know that also they paid for a private investigation firm to dig up into Canada Land's publisher, Jesse Brown, and his employee, Jaron Kerr. And as part of that investigation, they identified where his children went to school. I mention that because I find that very troubling, that the Liberals are so tied to an organization that seems to feel that they need to be hiring not just political operatives, but private eyes investigating journalists. I mean, this is Canada that this is happening in. So the other big news story that came out this month, November 1st, the Times of Israel reported, this is a quote, Wikipedia probe exposes an Israeli stealth PR firm that worked for scammers. And it says in the subheading, shining a rare spotlight on the murky business of online reputation management. Wikipedia editor points the finger at Percepto, an Israeli firm that helps wealthy clients bury dubious pasts. So that's the Times of Israel, November 1st, 2020. What I find really surprising here is that in their article about scammers and dubious pasts, they have a picture of the Kielburger brothers. I was absolutely floored by that because, again, this is the group that speaks in schools across the country that have been given almost quasi-ambassadorial status by the Liberal government. When the Liberals wanted to do a big event at the UN, they brought in we. When we wanted to go sell their brand in England, they brought the Prime Minister's wife with them. So is it possible that a child's charity, saying that they only spend money to help children in the third world, are hiring an Israeli disinformation team that comes from former Israeli military intelligence? Now, the military intelligence wing comes from Nir Shafrir, who's the partner and COO, who served in Unit 8200 of the Israeli Defense Force, and Yuval Levy, who's the CPA partner and CFO, who began his career as a military intelligence analyst for the Israeli army. So what does this group Percepto do? Well, they describe themselves, over the years, we've developed a rich arsenal of strategies. That's interesting for former military. They have a rich arsenal of strategies, which enables us to respond quickly and accurately in multiple languages and cultural contexts to all sorts of online challenges. We are fully aware of the complexities of our field, are accustomed to its dynamism, and are attentive to our clients' needs. No matter what circumstance you are facing, we find a way to protect your image, optimize your digital presence, and tell your story. Now, they do list, apparently in their clients, a number of pretty dodgy, Ukrainian oligarchs and other quasi-criminal behavior. So why would the Kielburger brothers, who do so much work in terms of public relations with children and third world charities in Kenya, need to hire a group that does online disinformation? Now, this is I want to be clear here. I'm just taking this from both the Globe and Mail and the Times of Israel report. But when the Times of Israel reported the we connection, the Kielburger connection, to this Israeli disinformation team, we responded and says, we charity did not hire Percepto or anyone associated with Percepto to edit we associated Wikipedia pages. In fact, we have never heard of Percepto until reading your article. Wow, okay, I could see that. I mean, why would a charity be hiring a disinformation team? But here's the thing. What the Times reported is that there was a Dropbox that identified their clients. And in their clients, they list we. So it's the thing that I find very confusing about this group. Whenever something seems very simple, there's actually much more complex. So how is it possible that, poor we is identified out of all the possible groups on Wikipedia to be drawn into this Israeli disinformation team and listed as a client when they say they've never heard of them? I say that because when I see the latest big media machine that's being rolled out while we are being obstructed by liberals, it raises questions about the credibility of the documents and the claims being made. Claims being made in full-page newspaper ads right now. So, this Toronto Star had to apologize for the op-ed that it ran that claimed that the independent financial audits had exonerated we completely. I read those reports. I didn't see it exonerated them. I saw it was interesting, but didn't certainly jive with the documents we had read. But the Toronto Star had to clarify and issue a statement because they didn't bother to tell their readers. This is Bruce Campion Smith, November 6, 2020. Failure to disclose backer of we charity reports left readers in the dark. And the subheadline was Transparency Please. That they didn't bother to say who commissioned these reports that supposedly exonerate we and pretty much undermines the claims and the works that our committee's been doing. So who paid for this? Well, it was the Stillman Foundation, and David Stillman, who's been speaking on behalf of We. Now, I don't think many of our people at our committee have probably ever heard of the Stillmans, because we probably don't travel in the circles where that kind of American money moves. But I'm finding it really interesting that an American group is funding Canadian ads, undermining the work of our parliamentary committee. So I did a Google search on David Stillman, and the first time his name came up to me was in a September 9th article in Maclean's magazine. And guess what it's about? It's about the Kielburgers. And the article is entitled "The Rise and Fall of We." The charity invented itself by an earnest 12-year-old now finds itself engulfed in cynical, star-studded cronyism. Cynical, star-studded cronyism. That's not me, that's Maclean's magazine. So they're talking about, what happened to We, that was started by Craig Kielburger when he was 12 years old. I mean, my God, we bought my daughter that book for Christmas when she was, I think, about 11, and she read that book. But they talk in the Maclean's article about the problems in the We organization, and that when they're faced with problems, they don't actually present independent outside credibility to validate. In fact, Kate Bahan of Charity, Managing Director at Charity Intelligence, is quoted in the Maclean's article saying that boards need to be independent from the charities they oversee. As a We donor, as somebody who donates to We Charity, I would want an independent director who hasn't previously worked with Mark Kielburger. The importance of having independence so that we have credibility. Now, the fact is that what we learn is that David Stillman, who's become the voice in this media campaign, was served on the board, worked for We Charity in the United States from 2010 to 2015 as a director of their U.S. operations. So David Stillman worked for We Charity for 5 years as their director. And he has served on the board of the We Charity. So when we're seeing a full-page ad from an American who says he represents the best of the charity sector, and he may do a lot of great charity work, the fact that he worked for We as a director of operations and is on their board, to me, is highly, highly problematic. And I think that's what got the Toronto Star in trouble, is that they didn't bother to explain that it's the Stillman Foundation that is hiring these reports. Now, I got to say what's interesting. So the Stillman Foundation is paying for these full-page ads, and David Stillman is the spokesman, the same David Stillman who worked for 5 years as a director of operations for We in the United States, was on their board. The Stillman Foundation, when questioned about this connection and this lack of transparency and this lack of independence in terms of why they were stepping forward, states that, well, that David Stillman is from another branch of the family and has no affiliation with the foundation and no involvement with the reports. I'm like, say what? So the Stillman Foundation pays for all the reports. David Stillman goes out and is the spokesperson for it. The David Stillman, who was on the board at We and who worked for them, he's not representing the Stillman Foundation. He's from another branch of the family. I mean, this is just wacky. Now, Chair, I ask you, now, if there was questions about Oxfam or Heart and Stroke Foundation or any other charity, would we be thinking that they would hire someone to exonerate them who'd worked for them, who then says, well, I'm not really involved with how the money, it just doesn't make sense. And I ask this because it's like whenever we start to look into the We Group and their multiple numbers of companies, it feels like we're in this rabbit hole that goes deeper and deeper and more labyrinths. We're talking about what should be pretty straightforward, a child charity. And how did that child charity get this government contract? Was it done right or was it done wrong? These should be very straightforward answers. The fact that my Liberal colleagues have spent 4 months obstructing a simple parliamentary report on whether this was done right or wrong, to me raises serious questions. So I want to go now to this. What they're claiming is the exoneration is the Torrigan report, and how they say that the Torrigan report completely exonerates we and the Kielburgers. It says, my conclusion that the evidence is clear that the government reached out to We Charity, not the reverse. That bureaucrats examined their options, considered other organizations like the YMCA and Shopify, and concluded that We Charity was the right choice. That's a pretty declarative statement. But what I find really surprising is that when you actually look at the documents that the government turned over, there were no meetings with YMCA or Shopify. So how do they claim that they actually had made this deal? Or how do they claim that we was considered out of a number of independent organizations, and it also came forward that this was the only choice when these other organizations had not been spoken to? So the other thing he says, the evidence that it was the government that reached out to We Charity, not the reverse. And he states, as been documented by the Finance Committee, it was senior bureaucrat Rachel Wernick who contacted Craig Kielburger to discuss We's potential involvement in administering the program that would later be known as CSSG. And while that's not as enticing a storyline as a generally accepted narrative, it happens to be the truth. Well, it's actually not the truth. I don't know where the Torrigan report read their documents. I know they certainly took the words of Minister Chagger. That was her line. They certainly took the advice or the claims of Craig and Mark Kielburger. That's their line. But if you look at the documents that identify how this deal came about, we see that the Kielburgers were reaching out for an initial program. And we're going to talk about that later, because that's a really interesting one. It's been very overlooked. But it was that meeting on April 7th, they met with Minister Ning. And on April 10th, Craig Kielburger wrote to Minister Chagger, I hope this finds you well and healthy. I'm sure the celebrations look a little different this year, but let me wish you a happy belated birthday. And during this difficult time, we're really inspired by your incredible efforts. Understanding you're aware of the conversation between our head of government relations, Sophia Marquez, and your team exploring ways we can assist in your objectives, I thought to share an update following our discussions with Minister Ning. So that's April 10th. So he's already been in contact with him through Sophia Marquez. Now, Sophia Marquez is an interesting character because she's listed as the head of government relations. She sets up all the meetings. That's a lobbyist. But we learned that we never bothered to register to lobby. They said they didn't do all that much work. Well, the documents show a big difference, that they did a lot of work. Not only were they so busy with the head of government relations, they'd actually posted for a manager of government relations, all while not bothering to register to lobby. The question of whether or not illegal lobbying was done to get this $900 million contract is something we could certainly look at in our committee report. But from this April 10th message to Minister Chagger, we get the famous April 17th meeting between Minister Chagger and Craig Kielburger and Sophia Marquez. Now, that was the meeting that Minister Chagger pretended never happened, that she claimed she never spoke to them. Then when we confronted her that she did speak to them, she claimed that she had never discussed at all anything to do about the youth entrepreneurial proposal, which did not exist then. But what we see from the documents, April 17th, this is how Craig Kielburger describes it. We Charity held a phone call with Minister of Diversity and Youth, Minister Bartosz Chagger, to discuss an unrelated project. Oh, sorry, this is what he's claiming. There's so much here, Mr. Chair, but just I won't go all day. It was at the April 17th meeting that they begin these conversations. So from that email on April 17th, on Monday morning, April 20th, Sophia Marquez writes, "Happy Monday. Thanks for your call. I want to give you a quick note following our meeting with Minister Chagger on the highlights." And that was Craig Kielburger was at the meeting. Minister Chagger expressed interest in exploring ways to adopt the entrepreneurship proposal we submitted to Minister Ning and include a service component to it. She said we should consider opening a service stream for youth who are currently not well supported through virtual mentorship. That effect, Craig reassured the minister that if given the right policies, we could amend the proposal. And Minister Chagger expressed, and this is Sophia Marquez saying what happened at that meeting, expressed her willingness as the next steps to connect with her team and identify tangible ways of moving this forward. I told her that I'd shared our proposal with you, Gina Wilson, Ritu, and Rachel Wernick over the weekend, and I have yet to hear back from her and her team members. Oh my God. Now, the Torrigan report tells us that it was Rachel Wernick who reached out to the Kielburgers. And remember that famous quote where the Kielburgers said they should never have accepted that call from Canada, but they felt duty bound to receive that call? Well, the call is clear. It came from Sophia Marquez as the lobbyist for We, that set up the meeting with Minister Ning, that then set up the meeting with Minister Chagger. And then, according to Sophia Marquez, then they reached out to Rachel Wernick on that weekend. The idea that Rachel Wernick came up on this idea on her own simply doesn't add up. Now, Mr. Chair, why am I putting this into the record? I'm putting this into the record because we have been obstructed for 4 solid months by the Liberals, who have refused to let us address these documents, have refused to let us question witnesses like Sophia Marquez to find out whether or not that lobbying, the nature of that lobbying, and whether that lobbying was even legal. We are having to put onto the record what actually happened, the truth of what happened in those documents, because we are facing this major campaign of disinformation and spin that's being paid for by American groups with full-page ads, with op-eds in the Toronto Star, with claims of independent review that simply don't meet the test of evidence. So for however long the Liberals want to drag this out, I think it would be worth our committee using this time actually to put into the record so people know what the documents actually say. Here's another one, just while I'm on it. April 22nd from Craig Kielburger to Bartosz Chagger. We appreciate your thoughtful offer to connect us with relevant members of your ministry. Over the weekend, our team has been hard at work to adapt your suggestion of a second stream focused on the summer service opportunity. Now, this is really interesting because we have Craig Kielburger saying that it was Minister Chagger's suggestion. Now, Minister Chagger told us at committee that she had never spoken to them about this proposal. But on April 22nd, Craig Kielburger thanks her for her suggestions and that she is going to open the doors. So that idea that it was poor Rachel Wernick, a civil servant, who took it upon herself, pushed this thing through, got everyone signed up, and this is the myth that's being promoted by the Kielburgers' very large funded organization right now, is not backed up by any of the facts. It's not backed up by the facts like the claim that they were financially solid. That's not really an issue for us one way or the other. They were certainly financially solid because they had enormous real estate holdings, which we haven't looked at. But the idea that the Kielburgers didn't need to do this, that the We Group was perfectly in good financial order, this is what's being claimed now, but it certainly doesn't meet the test of when we interviewed Michelle Douglas, who was the former chair, who was denied access to the financial reports. Now, to me, it's irrelevant to me whether the Kielburger Group was financially solid or not. What matters to me is that they're a charity. And as a charity, you have obligations to report. And Madame Douglas raises serious questions in her testimony about the fact that the board and the chair was denied access to the financial documents while massive amounts of layoffs and firings were happening. Why is that relevant? Again, we're dealing with a group that proposes to be a new kind of charity. But a new kind of charity or an old kind of charity has reporting obligations. Those reporting obligations are fundamental to its finances. So when Michelle Douglas told the Finance Committee that she had to resign because she could not get financial information from a charity that was laying off and firing hundreds of people, and that then she was fired for asking these questions along with much of the board, that raises a serious flag. And it raises a serious flag because we asked the Kielburger brothers about whether or not, according to the reports we had, that the Kielburgers had gotten very angry at the board and hung up on them and then phoned and said they wanted their resignation. We couldn't get a straight answer to that. This is about governance. This is about an organization that is duly bound to follow the rules. And yet, once again, we see, well, whether it was getting rid of their board, that's really questionable. Whether or not we can get answers at this parliamentary committee because the Liberals obstruct, that's very questionable. It's very questionable that they're hiring that they're getting support. And I don't know what the financial arrangements are with the Stillman Foundation, but that they're putting out people as supposed voices for them who worked for them. The fact that in the past, we see hirings of Republican, hardcore Republican media, disinformation teams, as well as this Israeli connection, is really, really disturbing. So was any of that germane to the work of the committee when we began? No, our committee focus was simply about why did they have such an inside track? But 4 months of obstruction by the Liberals is making me question, what was it about this group? What is it about their connections? How have they been able to insinuate themselves so tightly in the power structure of Canada to be able to call into ministers' offices when so many organizations are in free fall and be given this contract? And then to have the Liberals cover up for them, to have the Liberals obstruct, have the Prime Minister shut down Parliament so that we can't actually get the documents. It raises serious questions. So, Mr. Chair, I think I will stop for now, but I'm more than willing to continue looking into the questions that I think now need to put on the table regarding how this group operates, what the accountability mechanisms are, given that they are a group that works with children across this country and their deep connection to the Prime Minister, his family, and why my Liberal colleagues are so intent on obstructing our work.